Okay, I think we're about ready to start. Good morning and welcome everyone to Roma, Conversazioni Interdisciplinari. I would like to begin today by thanking Silvia Dell'Olio, with whom I have organized this event. Unfortunately, she cannot be physically here, but there will be a recording of this event. So she is anybody else who would like to see it at a later time will be able to do so. And by thanking the School of Architecture, Notre Dame International, and of course, all of you for coming today. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with Paolo Vitti and Center, Associate Professor in Practice at the School of Architecture of Notre Dame, Jonathan Weatherill, Associate Professor, also at the School of Architecture, and Luca Marcozzi, Professor of Italian Literature at the University of Roma 3 and Rome Associate of the Rome Global Gateway. I believe that this is a terrific chance for scholars of the RGG to share their research with colleagues, and for students, and honestly for all of us here, to be exposed to variegated methods of research. Today, speakers whose fields of expertise range from architecture to history to philology will discuss how their research interacts with the historical layering of the city of Rome. This is hopefully the first meeting of a series that will encourage dialogue across disciplines and will promote dissemination of knowledge as a collaborative enterprise at the RGG. Our first speaker will be Luca Marcotti. Luca Marcozzi is full professor of Italian literature at Roma 3 University and Rome Associate of the Rome Global Gateway. He mostly deals with the main authors and works of Italian literature, from the origins to Renaissance and beyond. He has published books and essays on Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Bimbo, Leopardi, and so on. He has been visiting professor at Notre Dame in 2013 as Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer. He is the coordinator of the Laureatus in Urbe annual conference dedicated to Petrarch and organized in collaboration with the RGG. He is the author and presenter of the podcast Parole in Pugno on Radio Immagina, immagina.edu if you would like to see that, and on Spotify. Today, his paper is entitled Petrarch on the Capitol at the Dawn of the Renaissance. Luca Marcozzi.
Okay, I'll take my time. So thank you for this kind presentation. That's really, I appreciate it very much. I don't see anything here, but I think that we are. I have to look back. Oh no, okay, and that's fine because I know. Okay, that's fine. So we are today. I will talk you about a topic that you probably already know, as Maria Sole told me, because you have visited the Capitol Hill. So you know that this author I'm dealing with was graduated, let's say so, on the Capitol in 1341. During my researches, I met several authors dealing with Rome, starting from Dante. We have here Chiara Sbordoni, who is the most the most expert scholar on the relationship between Dante and Rome. So I won't talk about this topic. Only just a few words to say that Rome's Petrarch is very, very different from Dante's Rome. Dante, if he had ever been in Rome, I have several doubts on his journey to Rome, even if he talks about Rome in the Divine Comedy. However, he talks only about the Christian Rome, the places of the Jubilee that he probably saw in the first Jubilee of 13,000. So he talks about the bridge in front of Castel Sant'Angelo, the Pinecone of St. Peter, the Lateran nearby, St. John, where that was the seat of the Pope. While Petrarch is mostly devoted to another kind of history and another kind of town, the classical Rome, the ruins of Rome. And on the ruins of Rome, he saw in his first journey towards the Eternal City in 1337, he founded really founded the idea of restoring the ancient. That is the idea at the basis of what we call humanism and Renaissance. Renaissance is exactly, the word says that the ancient thought, the ancient architecture, the ancient history has to undergo a rebirth, Renaissance, so to say. So Petrarch wasn't born in Rome, of course. He was born in Arezzo, near Florence, where he was exiled, where his father, who was a friend of Dante, close friend of Dante, was exiled along with Dante in 1302. And he lived most of his life between the Provence near Avignone and Vaucluse, and then other towns in Italy like Parma, Padova, Milan, and Venice. Even if he called himself Florentinus, from Florence, Franciscus de Pencraco de Florencia, in his own signature, he stayed in Florence for 2 or 3 days in his life, going back and forward from Rome during the Jubilee of 1350. And he wanted to be, in fact, actually he was, he wanted to be considered as a Roman citizen. Actually, he was, because he was appointed as a Roman citizen in the occasion of the laurel crowning in 1341. Why Petrarch is so important? Because he is the first, in my opinion, to know and to understand that there had been something like a Middle Age, obscurity, a period, a moment, several centuries, where the ancient glory of Rome was ruined and destroyed by historical events, that there was a discontinuity between the ancient Rome and the present Rome. And he is really the first to understand this fracture in the centuries and in the course of history. While Dante's thought about Rome was, let's say, a continuity in political terms between the idea of empire heading Rome in the past and that of his times, Petrarch was more accurate and, let's say, realistic in his view of the political thought of his times and the political role of Rome. Even also because at these times, as you sure know, Rome had been abandoned by the Pope, who started to live in Avignon as during the first years of Petrarch's life. And all of his life was devoted, from a political point of view, to restore the papacy in Rome and to restore an idea of Rome following her ancient glory. Petrarch arrived in Rome for the first time in 1337, but before that, when he was at Avignon at the papal court, and he was a lawyer or an employee of some big families like the Colonna, who had cardinals and bishops and were a big part of the papal court in Avignon, he probably, we don't know exactly for which purpose, but probably he was asked by the Colonna family to, to encourage a new jubilee in 1350. So he started writing letters, in form of Latin poems to the popes, whose topic was the ruin of Rome and the fact that Rome was abandoned by the Pope and crying like a widow, weeping and crying and mourning the absence of the Pope. And by this absence, because of this, of the fact that the Pope was in Avignon, Rome was collapsing. All the monuments and the churches were ruining and the St. John's, the church, the Basilica of San Giovanni had was destroyed by fire a few years before the letters that Petrarch addressed to the popes. He wrote 3 letters to the popes, 2 to Benedict XII and 1 to Clement V, between 1335 and 36. We are now dealing only with the first of them. Really in brief, I will present some texts that are, can I say, come faccio andare avanti? Ah, presente, dove? Ah, sorry. Okay. Okay. This is a harsh translation from Latin that I made, because these letters, they don't even have a modern critical edition. We are reading them from nowadays from the 15th century editions. There are some scholars tried to do that. However, we are reading these letters in very harsh texts. However, this is the first letter to the Pope, to Benedict XII, where Rome is, as you see, described as a widow, an exiled woman, poor, frail in appearance and neglected. She knelt as a suppliant not long ago to your saints' thresholds. She had no companionship on the journey. How little loyalty goes, bad luck, she had stolen her friends from her, and so on. Surprising, she says, I wanted to know about her journey, so that she would weep where she came from, and then her name, her country, her lineage. Speaking of her in Latin about her was accompanied by an already ample dress worn by time. 3 times I was about to speak, but 3 times, this is a memory of the Aeneid of Virgil, the restraint was held back the words. Meanwhile, in the midst of some sad murmuring, she screamed her name. She was Rome. So this is the dramatic incipit, the dramatic starting of the first letter of Petrarch to the Pope. After that, I have a few I had to run. In these letters, Petrarch talks first of the Christian Rome. He makes a huge and very long list of relics, starting from the Domine Quo Vadis on the Appia Road, and then from the Sancta Sanctorum in St. John, and then from other relics containing, let's say, this one is probably the crown of Jesus Christ that is conserved in the Sancta Sanctorum, was the place where all the relics, the biggest and most important relics of the ancient Christianism were set. In the second letter, he also talks about the classical Rome without having seen it, only starting from his books. At this time, Petrarch has not ever been in Rome yet. So he's talking, for example, about the episode that it's also in Dante, in the Purgatory, of Trian and the widow. He's talking about Rome as a widow, and so he exploits this metaphor of the widow, talking about the history of Trian and the widow, that it was a very common, a very common tale, exemplar tale in the Middle Ages. And it probably, the source of this episode is not the Colonna Traiana, but the Arco di Costantino. But I'm not talking about that. He made the first journey in 1337. And this is the entire familial letter, the first letter written by Rome. It's so short, as you see. He says that he has not many words because he's so surprised by the greatness of the town that he cannot really talk easily about that. But what is very important is the last lines. Sorry, it's not this one. This is the the framework. This is the letter. It's very, very, very short. This is in Latin, obviously, but this is the harsh English translation. The last line, the last chapter, this last paragraph of the letter is very important. Truly Rome was greater, and the remains are greater than I imagined. Now I'm not surprised that the world has been tamed by this city, but I'm surprised that it has been tamed so late. And also he was burning by desire. He where it is, I did delay against my will, fear my eyes might waken what I had imagined in my mind. So the expectations he had were great, because he had read about the glory of Rome in his books and in his beloved authors, among those Livy, Cicero, Ovid, Virgil, mostly Livy, who was the author of a history of Rome that Petrarch was the first to rediscover in his early years. Sorry. After that, he came back in 1341 for the ceremony of the crowning that was held on the Capitoline Hill. We are not sure about the date, probably the 8th of April, 1341, even if Petrarch later on said that it was held on the 6th of April, because it was a date that he venerated. He used this exact date, the 6th of April, for the encounter with, for the first sight with his beloved Laura, for the death of Laura, and so on. However, probably it was on the 8th, actually, of April. In Epistola Metrica, he describes, like, my time is end, but it's come to an end, but I will really speak for another minute or so. He describes what happened during this ceremony. The very important there are many important words to consider. One of the most important is that he's gathered by the Romans, by nobles, and but by a great crowd, made also by noblemen and people that were there on the descent of the Capitol Hill to greet him, to congratulate with him, and to watch this ancient ceremony. And also that at the end of the ceremony, he went from the Capitol to St. Peter to offer the laurel crown to St. Peter, to God, also to put his triumph and his poetic glory under sacred, let's say, a sacred name. We have here later representations of this ceremony. We should talk also about, he talks about, this is obviously the place where the Palazzo Senatorio, the Petrarch called it the Senate, but it wasn't the Senate. The Senate is here in Largo Argentina, the ancient Republican Senate. However, later representations of this ceremony, starting from the 16th century, are based upon the what Petrarch says about that. This is a 16th century edition of Petrarch's poems. This is a 19th century portrait. This is engraving coming from a big, from this one. We don't know either if the ceremony was held an open air or inside a palace. However, this is Petrarch going up to the hill, gathered by the crowd. So the triumph is, we know about this triumph only by Petrarch. So the fact that it was a very brilliant and big and important and historical ceremony is due. We know it only because the main character, let's say so, of this ceremony has told us so. So we don't know anything about this except the words of the same poet involved in the ceremony. So it also should be everything false. But however, after that, Petrarch supports Cola di Rienzo in the Roman Revolution against the Orsini and the Colonna family, who were mostly the Colonna. He was at the service of the Colonna, so his supporters. Then Cola is caught and killed, and Petrarch immediately forgot this support and this political, let's say, fever, let's say so, that he had in this time. The last journey is that of the Jubilee, 1350. About this journey, I want to described in this familiar letter. I'm writing here, I'm translating what I wrote in the biography of Petrarch that I wrote with Francisco Rico for the Dizionario Biografico degli Italiani, and then published from Adelphi in a book called I Venerdì del Petrarca, Petrarch's Fridays. In 1350, while Petrarch was really can I say, a big lover of the town, but in this year, about the journey in 1350, he doesn't say quite anything. He doesn't want to represent to the public this journey. He only says that he made this journey without looking at the classics, relics, and ruins, without looking at the monuments, at the memories of the poets he had. He went here as a Christian, only providing for the care of the soul. He visited the temples of God with Christian devotion. So he transformed himself from a historian who had the cult of the classics and of the antiquity in a philosopher, in a Christian philosopher who had to care mostly about himself and his soul than to history. That's it. He wanted to come back in Rome in 1370, also to greet the Pope that had come back in 67 and stayed in Viterbo, but he couldn't. He would die within 4 years, even if he was called in Rome to greet the Pope coming back to Rome, something that he always wanted to, this return, he always wrote to prepare this return in his life. He couldn't, but in his last will, he asked to be buried, if possibly in Rome, among other cities, reliving not only his image of Peregrinus Ubique, but also the myth of Homer that had 7 towns and 7 motherlands, let's say so. Okay, my time has come to an end, and so thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Luca, for really making Petrarch's Rome come alive for us. Our next speaker is Professor Paolo Vitti. Paolo is an associate professor of the practice of the School of Architecture of Notre Dame. His field of expertise are ancient architecture, construction history, preservation of heritage, cultural heritage politics, and climate change. He has been working on several archaeological sites in Italy and in the Mediterranean, including the Colosseum, the Palatine, Paestum, Sybaris, and other sites in Calabria, Greece, and Cyprus, Turkey, and Tunisia. For UNDP, he has worked for heritage preservation in post-conflict areas such as Cyprus and Palestine. Since 2017, he has worked in Morocco for several programs in heritage preservation and education. Today, he will talk about divinity and power. Paolo, Vitti.
Hello. Rome is so exciting, has so many layers. We, as architects, we always work with the tangible part, but the tangible part is connected to many elements that are intangible, particularly express many facts, many the ideology behind a program. And today I want to connect with my studies on Roman architecture in Rome, and particularly with Hadrian. My students know that I have a long passion discussing about the Mausoleum of Hadrian, so the topic is related to this building. But I would like to give a narrative that is goes back to the understanding of the significance, and hence the title, Divinity and Power, which wants to see what stands behind the program of this extraordinary building, which was the Mausoleum of Hadrian, then Castel Sant'Angelo. Castel Sant'Angelo itself is the symbol of Rome, particularly a very strong symbol until the reconstruction of St. Peter's in early 16th century, when actually the sheer dimension of the new basilica became an element which changed also the dimension, the perception of Castel Sant'Angelo. Castel Sant'Angelo was the place where, arriving from the north, it was in the countryside, you could see this massive construction, and has been for centuries the symbol of the city of Rome, particularly in medieval times. So I can imagine Petrarch arriving from the north. What he could see first is the mole, it was called the volume, the massive volume of Castel Sant'Angelo. So let's go back now and try to track a little bit of the history of this place. And I will start with going in present-day Algeria, and we have an incredible, massive mausoleum, which is built in the 3rd century BCE. And it has a very familiar form, because it has a mound on the very top. It's a stone mound, but recalls the idea of the burial place, a place where there is a tumulus on it. And so it visualizes a place of also of worship, or becomes also a monument in the sense of memory of something. And this, many scholars have connected this monument to another important sepulchre, which is maybe of the greatest of all the ancient kings, who is Alexander the Great. This place is unknown. It's located. His burial place was in Alexandria. We know that Julius Caesar, when he arrived to Alexandria, he wanted to see, all the emperors wanted to go and see this place, where was the person who, for the first time in the history of the West, there was someone who was so powerful. He was king and god in life, and so he could really represent the model for many other monarchs throughout the time, including Napoleon, not to say one of the last ones, who was obsessed by repeating the fabulous story of Alexander the Great. He went to Egypt emulating Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt. And when he arrived there, he was he was at the sanctuary in Iowa. He was there. He was declared God in life. So this monument here might be considered something that was influenced by this unknown burial place, mausoleum of Alexander the Great. And there is another one. It dates slightly later, is equally huge, massive, and is also in present-day Algeria. Is the Royal Mausoleum. It's something that dates at the time of Augustus. So we are getting closer to a person who has changed the history of Rome, who is Octavian, declared Augustus in 27 BCE, and as you see, the last king of Mauritania, Juba II, and his wife, Cleopatra Selene. Cleopatra connects to Egypt, so it goes from the dynasty, the Greek dynasty of Egypt, and they had strong bonds with Rome. So and this has many elements. This other mausoleum has many elements who become significant for the understanding of the Mausoleum of Hadrian, as we will see. And then comes, of course, the Mausoleum of Augustus, an incredibly huge, massive construction never seen in the city of Rome, which, according to the last interpretation, which we had the pleasure to hear exactly in this room 6 months ago, with the presentation of Elisabetta Carnabugi, who came with a new construction. We know about the structure. We strive to understand exactly the architectural form. However, what we know, it was 50 meters high and had a diameter of 80 meters. So it was really massive. The Mausoleum of Augustus is connected to the Pantheon. It is connected to the Pantheon through an overall system which was set in a moment when Campus Martius, that is to say the area which is north, let's say, of Piazza Argentina, present-day Piazza Argentina, going towards the gate of Piazza del Popolo, is the area which was free from constructions. So there was this massive construction, which was the Mausoleum of Hadrian, of Augustus, and then there was the Pantheon. And the Pantheon was facing the Mausoleum of Augustus and not giving the back to the core of the city of Rome. So just creating a relationship. Which is the significance of the Pantheon? The Pantheon, you see here a scheme showing the relationship between the two massive round buildings. Which is the significance of the Pantheon? The Pantheon is the place of the temple to the 12 gods, the gods of the Olymp, and it was the 12 gods are always, let's use the word, used by the kings to show were used by the kings to show their relationship with the divine. And this is the case of Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. And in Alexandria, we had the Temple of the Muses, which was exactly a pantheon, a place with the 12 gods, where, of course, the kings of Egypt were having their statues with the 12 gods. So this is the same case and the significance of what Agrippa did when he built the first Pantheon. And the first Pantheon was meant to offer Octavian the chance to be between the 12 gods. Octavian refused, as he used to do, and his policy was clearly more careful from the one of Julius Caesar, which, as you know, was murdered because of his attempts to get a higher position and become a divinity in life. At the times of Hadrian, this red line you see on the left is the itinerary, the funerary itinerary to get to the very center of the Campus Martius, where there were located the pyres that were lit when the emperor was died. And at that moment, when the pyre was lit, an eagle was freed, and this eagle was representing the element which will bring the soul of the emperor up to the sky in order that he could become a divinity. And this symbolism connected divinity and power were so clear and so understandable by the people. And there is no doubt that these architectures, that they were, of course, architectures made, temporary architectures, as the pyres were meant to visualize this sense of the place where the emperor will be burned and go up to the sky. So this architecture, made by different stories, you see here on the right, inspired in some way also the architecture of the buildings. And here we have something that you might have seen in the Vatican museums, is the base of the column of the Antoninus Pius, which was in the Campus Martius. And we see exactly here given all the symbols of the power and divinity. On the left, we see the Campus Martius, who is holding of course, the obelisk of the sundial built by Augustus. On the right, there is Minerva, the symbol of Rome. And then this eagle, these two eagles, which are bringing up to the sky Antoninus Pius and Faustina on the back of a winged genius. So this is the symbolism in the way connects the power of the emperor to the divinity. So there was also a need to give a more tangible vision of that, and this was the Mausoleum of Hadrian. The Mausoleum of Hadrian, built by the Emperor Hadrian, so soon after the death of Trajan and before Antoninus Pius, is an extraordinary building which is now being unveiled by research, my research conducted in the last 10 years. And I'm very happy that I arrived late today because I just met with the director of Casa Sant'Angelo, and we are restarting the research exactly in this period. And this is a building which has, let's say, two phases. One is intimate, is what happens in the inside, is the place where is the burial of the emperor, and is a place when you enter in Casa Sant'Angelo, you enter into a kind of labyrinth where you lose knowledge and sense of the tangible part of life, and you enter in a divine, if you want, dimension. And all this with a rotunda on the very top, you see it here, and the rotunda is nothing less than the Pantheon, is nothing less than the symbol of divinity. So connects the mausoleum with the divinity. And then, okay, these are the different parts that connect. And then the external architecture. And the external architecture is exactly what we discussed, inspired by the system of the architecture of the pyres, inspired by the monumental mausolea in Algeria, and maybe inspired to Alexander the Great, inspired to the Mausoleum of Augustus, so creating a lineage from of divinity in the past to Hadrian. And we recognize at the center of the colonnade a false door, which is the gate, the typical gate for the soul to go up to the sky. And this was visible. It was so huge, so high, that was visible from all the hills around the city of Rome. What happened? It happened that, of course, Aurelian built his walls around the city, and the mausoleum remained outside this. 273, Aurelian built the walls, but of course, this massive construction could not be excluded from the fortification, because exactly being a threat for the city if in the hands of the enemy. And this sets the new history of Castel Sant'Angelo, which of course is used again as a place to display power. And the mausoleum from this becomes the Castel Sant'Angelo. And the upper part is, you see, is the addition that was made, is what we see is from the Middle Ages, but particularly from the period of Alexander VI and of the 15th century that starts the construction. And from this, we see the Roman part standing below the brickwork that was created by Alexander VI. In the Middle Ages, when Petrarch was here, the city had towers. Every family has its own fortified set in the city, and of course, also Castel Sant'Angelo was a fortified place of more than any other. But this was destined to an end. And the end was set in the moment when, after the popes returned from Avignon, when they realized that Castel Sant'Angelo was not only a powerful fortress, but it was also an opportunity to create a new palace. And so, if this is a very romantic but realistic view of Castel Sant'Angelo before the construction of the neighborhood of the Prati, as one could have perceived in one of the floods of the river Tiber, with the two massive volumes of Castel Sant'Angelo and St. Peter. Actually, Castel Sant'Angelo was really something that had its own identity in the cityscape of the city, particularly visible here. Again, notice the elder St. Peter, the dimension of the old basilica compared to the massive volume of Castel Sant'Angelo, and then of course changed with the construction of St. Peter. But when we look at the Castel Sant'Angelo today, we discover that there is a central part which is not medieval, and this is the palace that after Alexander VI, actually with Julius II and Clemens VII, they started to create an amazing place, an amazing palace, fortified palace in the city of Rome. And this is the hall made by Paul III, the Farnese. And here he displays, of course, all the hall is Alessandro Farnese, Paul III. There are the histories of Alexander the Great. Oh, how come? And the histories of St. Paul. And here we have at the two ends of the hall, we have the history remains, the two ends of the history of the start and the transformation. On one side, we have the portrait of Hadrian, and the opposite side, we have the archangel who is connected to the history of the castle when Gregory the Great dedicated the chapel on the very top of Castel Sant'Angelo. So here you see divinity and power and much more to discover in the city of Rome. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, for sharing with us a really exciting piece of news about the starting again of the unearthing, literally, of the Hadrian's Mausoleum. It's great that this is like also the occasion for sharing just kind of news. We will move on to our next and final paper for today with Jonathan Weatherill. Jonathan is an associate professor at the School of Architecture at Notre Dame. He is a practicing architect who has lived in Italy since graduating from the Architectural Association in London over 20 years ago. He runs his own practice and has also collaborated in 2014 with 2014 Treehouse laureate. Let me know if I said it correctly. Okay, great. Pier Carlo Bontempi, since they met in Milan 30 years ago. His professional experience has spanned genres of modernism and classicism in a wide range of fields, from industrial design to restoration and urban planning. He is inspired by the timelessness of the rural vernacular and the elegant equilibrium of architectural language of the past. His work is the result of an eclectic education informed by his varied experience and the comprehension of local reality through investigation and on-site and archival documentation. Today, he will talk about new vernacular architecture. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Maria Sole, for this. So this is really going to be it's a summary of really ongoing research, which I've been doing for a long time, which is instrumental to my practice. Research is really part of the design process. Understanding the local reality and understanding how you can address that local reality is very important. So vernacular architecture comes in very handy in this. So what is vernacular architecture? And you'll be asking me, what am I supposed to be talking about Rome? Well, we'll get there eventually. But vernacular architecture is vernacular because it is forced to be built with local materials. It, with very little means, addresses the climate conditions, the environmental conditions of the site, the exact location where it's located. And it reflects the cultural makeup of the society that creates it. So it is a really very important representative of the identity of a place, both through its materials and through its form, which is closely related to how people in that area live. And it is inherently sustainable because you're using materials which are gathered from, right next to the site, and without using plant engineering, you are trying to cool the building and keep it warm in the winter. So my ongoing research is really how vernacular architecture is created, the mechanisms, precise mechanisms which form vernacular architecture. And I'm going to start from a very long way away, and a long time ago. This is where I come from, which is Bermuda. And the reason why this is a very good case study is because Bermuda, up until 1609, was completely uninhabited. There was nothing here except cedar forests, beautiful beaches. The rocks you see there are coral limestone, millennia old, very similar to tufa rock in the Lazio region. And what happened in 1609? Colonists from England going to Virginia shipwrecked, and they were the first people to actually shipwreck on the island and survive. None of the people on the ship died, and they all managed to get on a life raft and get to the main island the next day. There are lots of shipwrecks around Bermuda because of the coral reefs, but until 1609, maybe the English were the Navy was so strong because they actually knew how to swim. Spanish sailors didn't know how to swim. So there are a lot of Spanish galleons around the islands, but there are no Spanish natives. Now, these people who are on this ship and the following settlers who then met them and joined them in the following years came from a very small, precise area of the southwest of England. So the knowledge of architecture they brought with them was very, very limited, and they had a very, very strong cultural identity of their own, and they could start afresh with a blank slate. So you were really creating vernacular architecture from scratch. Of course, because the island was covered with cedar forests, the first thing they did was to try and build wooden houses. The wooden houses didn't last as long as a year because they found the climatic conditions were not favorable to that. It's very windy. It has 100% humidity all year round, salt air. So wood construction, if it's not really well seasoned and treated, just disintegrates. But they found stone. The identity they brought with them was, basically the southwest of England, Dorset, Somerset, cottage architecture. But they also had knowledge of other places which weren't quite as lowly. This is still cottage architecture. There were manor houses. They aspired also to greater things. So you have a porch on the front of Hamoon Manor in Dorset here. And there were even more grand pieces of architecture being created. The buildings we'll see in Bermuda are mostly early 18th century, late 17th century, so 1680s, 1690s, 1700s. This is Kew Palace in London, which is otherwise known as the Dutch House. This kind of decorative detail of gables was common in the late 17th century and very popular. This is Montacute House in Dorset. So this is exactly where the people who come to Bermuda are coming from. You can see how those details are repeated there. And another very important piece of influence was this. Now, this brings us all to the whole discussion of how precedent is important throughout architecture, and even in Roman tombs, we see that they use precedent. I noticed that with Paolo's talk. This is particularly important because this is a house which still exists. It's called Kingston Lacy, and it was designed by an architect called Roger Pratt in the 1660s. Now, Roger Pratt worked with Inigo Jones, so we have a indirect link back to Rome here. We have Inigo Jones, who came to Italy. Roger Pratt came to Italy, came to Rome, visited Rome in the 1640s. Together, they studied Palladio. They brought back Palladio's 4 books to England, and thanks to Inigo Jones and his associates, Palladio became worldwide, popular. You may notice here, this is Kingston Lacy was then later modified very strongly by Charles Barry in the 19th century. Charles Barry was an eclectic architect, designed the Houses of Parliament, which are very Gothic, of course, but he also did neoclassical architecture. I won't show you what he did to this building. It's very nice, but it doesn't look like it anymore. But it's important to see what it looked like when the settlers of Bermuda actually went there. Another house which is by Roger Pratt is, oops, I've skipped one here. Come on. Or is it? There it is. This is our Coles Hill house. This one, unfortunately, doesn't exist anymore. It was burnt down. It was given to the National Trust, and as was quite commonly the case, the National Trust, by accident, perhaps, burnt it to the ground, so it no longer exists. But you can see here very familiar motifs, which you may know of. You will probably see more of these in the fall when you go back to the United States. Roger Pratt's houses, he built a few of them, 2 or 3 houses, became very, very popular. His architecture was embraced by the Counter-Reformation sort of puritanical colonists that came from England to the north of America, to Virginia. And you can see here elements which are repeated in the governor's house in Williamsburg, steep roof with the big chimneys on the corner, the parapet on the top, the lantern in the middle. And the element which is brought to Bermuda specifically is the staircase, which is known as a welcoming arms staircase in Bermuda, because it opens up as it goes down and sort of embraces the visitor. So this is a plan of Coleshill House. So taking these elements, cottage architecture, manor house architecture, stately homes, which were then also imported to North America and became plantation houses and governors' houses. The early Bermudians built these houses in stone. The stone was quarried on site. It was basically soft tufa stone you can cut with a saw, and it hardens with the air. This is the old rectory of St. George's, which was the old capital city of Bermuda. It's the oldest continually inhabited town in the New World, St. George's. So what you see here, you see the front porch, you see the staircase which comes down and with the balustrades which flare open. You see the little bit of Dutch gabling on the top. Another one here, Church Hill House, very, very strong element of Roger Pratt with this staircase on the front of it. And other houses. This is the Tucker's house in St. George's again. This is curious because it's not something which is really coming from England, but it's also actually an element which you can see in northern Italy, which is this Profello staircase on the outside of the house, which was later then covered over with the porch. Elements you can see inside, which are common in stately homes at the time, are the doors to the side of the fireplace, and what they call the tray ceiling. The tray ceiling adds height to the inside of the house and allows the heat to rise. So you have a whole series of elements which create this. I'm not going to dwell too much more on it. This is more Dutch gabling at the back of the Tucker's house. You have a whole series of elements which form what then becomes the common Bermuda vernacular architecture. These are all buildings from the late 1600s, early 1700s. So it's conditioned strongly by the available materials, the climate of the country. There are all sorts of theories of why the chimneys are at one end of the house. The chimneys are generated at the end of the house, which is where the prevailing winds come from to protect it from the wind. And another element of this vernacular architecture is the aspiring to something slightly greater than just a sort of little country box. So this is a very, very clear example of the very precise mechanisms that can create a simple architecture which really gives an identity to the people. Another case study, let's say, call it that I'm studying at the moment, which is really a part of the ongoing research I'm doing, brings us to Rome, of course, which is, all of this comes back to Rome, but Garbatello specifically was a new garden city designed in the 1920s by Gustavo Giovannone and Innocenzo Sabatini. And so they created what then became a new architecture for Rome. I mean, it was obviously, taking precedent from old Roman architecture, and it became what is known as the Barocchetto. This is where it was born in Garbatello. But the basic underpinnings of the architecture of the Garbatello, as it was a garden city on the edge of the city, and it was for people of little means, is originally of rural extract. So you're taking architecture from the Lazio countryside, bringing it into the edge of the city and adding little elements on it to nobilize it. So the mechanisms are similar to Bermudian architecture in this case. It's a little bit more short-lived. Then the war happens, rationalism happens, architecture in general takes over in other directions. But you can see quite clearly sort of farmhouse motifs here, which I have yet to actually go and document properly. But this is, as I said, it's ongoing research. So where does this go? Where does this lead me? The reason why I do this is that so I can then understand how I can take elements which are identifying of a place and use them for new architecture in an appropriate way. Italy, where I work, is basically blighted like every country by the same problems, and there's no real better illustration of these problems than what is the Via Emilia in northern Italy. The Via Emilia is a Roman road, runs from the southeast corner of Milan to the coast of the Adriatic Sea in a dead straight line. And it goes through all the major towns along the way, some of which you've seen, such as Bologna. This is the center of Parma. This is the Via Emilia in the center of Parma. If you go 2 kilometers out, this is what it looks like, the same road. So you have this is the worldwide problem we have everywhere, where new architecture expands the city and moves out into the countryside. You create formless, anonymous suburbs. This could be Grape Road, in Mishawaka. So I started to address this with the architect I worked with, who I still work with, that Maria Sole mentioned, who is Piercarlo Bontempi, and we began designing, building first traditional housing developments and urban conglomerations in northern Italy, taking the local vernacular and reapplying it. And this is what I'm doing myself now in the project which I'm working on at present. I'm working in an even more problematic situation. This is a suburban town on the south edge of Milan. This was built, it's called Rozzano. It was built in the Milanese Greenbelt in the 1960s and 70s to house immigrants from the south of Italy. I think Maria Sole is looking at this and she knows it quite well. It was built in the 1960s and 70s to house a huge wave of immigrants that came from the south of Italy. They needed housing, lots of it, very quickly. The urban and architectural precedent they used for these, as you see, precedent is always present. This is still Rozzano. You might think it's not. And that's because the precedent they really literally used was that of the Soviet suburb. The administration at the time had those political leanings, and it was their utopia of what a city should look like. Big modular housing blocks, lots of green space between them, which is positive, of course, but otherwise very soulless. This is what it looks like on the ground. This is you can see the low building is a derelict shopping street, because obviously no one really wants to go shopping there. It's mixed use, but it's not usable. It's mixed unuse, because what people do is they get in their cars and they go to a local mall, like they do in Grape Road in Mishawaka. These are some of the shops which are still existing. So you have high-rise cement towers and very low-rise, poor-quality commercial buildings. Another view of the center of the town. Now, the administration of the town is now very, very much more enlightened. They are very much aware that these are tower blocks that were built in the 60s and 70s. As you may know, reinforced concrete has a lifespan of about 50 or 60 years. So these buildings are now in structurally unsound condition for the most part, and they won't be restored. The town came to us, and the project eventually got directed straight to me to design a new identity for the town. They gave me 2 these disused sports grounds to develop as traditional neighborhoods. So what I did to start with was try and latch on to elements of identity of the place which may have pre-existed before the town was developed in the 60s and 70s. And there's really very little. I mean, there's one street in the old town, which is this, where the old town hall was, with some simple Northern Lombard vernacular architecture. That's about it. A little bit of a small conglomeration there. You can see some tower blocks in the background encroaching. Looking a little bit further afield, vernacular architecture along the canals outside of Milan. This is Gaggiano. Now, the thing about vernacular architecture is that it was built for a certain time period, and we are often criticized for building things which look old and are not of our time. But there are ways you can adapt it, and you can modify it, and you can recreate it and make it apply much more appropriately to modern uses. The drawback of this architecture, which you might be able to see there, it looks very picturesque. But if you take it, the elements of it are really very simple, and there's not a lot. It's a simple house with windows. So apart from the color changes, the decorative painting on the facade, it's quite monotonous. there are very few balconies which you can actually use, because those outside balconies don't get used in the summer because people would get devoured by mosquitoes. So I start to look a bit further abroad. This is Aliata Grasso. This is back in Rozzano itself. The more identifying elements of the city, the town, are larger complexes. The Visconti Castle in the north part of the town, the canal front, and agricultural structures along the canal. This is actually housing for textile workers in the 19th century, before the rest of the town was developed, and old farm workers' buildings. So there we have the extent of what was in Rozzano. This is a neighboring town of Corsica, again, very simple, fairly monotonous vernacular architecture. So I had to be a bit inventive and try and look further afield. And this is Lomellina. You have another small town. This is called Pieve del Cairo. It's in the middle of nowhere, but very beautiful. And you can see very clear references to classical architecture used in the vernacular there. But as the main identifying trait of Rozzano is actually agricultural, this is the one of the major farms that's still existing in terms of its building in the center of Rozzano. It's now the library. This is the farm. These are the farm buildings of the castle. My images, I think, are rather heavy and taking a while to. What I did is look further abroad to agricultural architecture. Now, Northern Italy has the most astounding agricultural tradition. This is, some of you have seen it. It's on the precedent folder for your studio project. This is the Gonzaga family's farm to the north of Mantua. The Gonzaga family, after being warlords, made their money and their income from cultivating rice and selling it to Venice. So this is their rice farm. And as you can see, because it creates so much wealth for them, the agricultural buildings themselves are elevated to the form of temples. This is designed and built by Giulio Romano in 1530s, late 1530s up until about 1540. So before 1541, and you can see the pediment on top of the barn building. This is actually a granary. Is a temple pediment. So it's not Palladio that actually takes the temple pediment and puts it on non-religious buildings. Giulio Romano does this way before Palladio. He did it in the Palazzo Te, in the pavilions in the garden, and here it actually comes off out of the top of the building on the top of a farm building. This is obviously very much the most sort of elevated and elaborated version you can find of that, but the principles behind this are similar to the same principles that then pervade in agricultural architecture in Lombardy from then on. So what you're looking at in most of the case in agricultural architecture in Lombardy is the ground level of a Roman palazzo, taken from Ostia Antica, where you have the shop at the ground floor, the shopkeeper's house just above it. This is more farm workers' housing. This is one of the best examples of this. This is a Visconti farm along the canal out of Milan, where you have very clear Roman motifs. So this is all material which I take and then mix up and put together. And these are my first sort of attempts at recreating a new vernacular architecture for the south of Milan. The material that I'm using to design this has been gathered over years and years, and I know the area quite well, so I can fairly confidently say that this is very profoundly Lombard and continues the identity of the place. What happens here is there are as many possibilities made as I can to create loggia spaces rather than balconies. So loggias, which can actually be the main difference, is that they can be closed in with mosquito netting, so people could actually use these in the summer. So this is a big plus. You can recognize elements I've taken from the local vernacular and reapplied here. and from some agricultural buildings as well. So, I mean, my goal through doing this research is to understand how to create architecture which is not monumental, but is very closely identifying the place, preferably made with local materials, as vernacular architecture would be, proportions and window openings and wall sizes that favor the automatic climate control of the buildings in the summer and the winter, and provide people with a place where they're happy to live rather than feel is there sort of a soulless wasteland. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all of three very generous presenters sharing with us their current project and their current research, unveiling the various layers of Rome or Italy in certain cases, dealing with languages in their written, visual, spatial forms. I've had several moments of aha moments, like things that I've learned today that I've never heard before. And I have several questions for all of our three speakers. But first, I would like to hear from the audience if they have any questions. And I will ask probably to our speakers to join the stage so that they can answer questions. I will be walking around with a microphone. So put on my mask again. What?
It's the time where the thoughts go towards
Lunch.
So
I know that. That could be the case. But so we'll be kind with our public. But any questions? Comments? Oh, there's two.
Okay, hello. This is for Professor Weatherill, but if the other panelists would like to respond as well, that'd be great. So you're starting to talk about examples of like negative existing vernacular when you're talking about kind of the picturesque, but also not really functional and sometimes monotonously simple buildings that sometimes exist in a place. How do you kind of go about parsing out the good from the bad with the vernacular? And in the case where you're in a place, because I think a lot of us come from towns that don't necessarily have a super strong traditional vernacular. It's, you know, and especially in cases of urban sprawl or something like that, there could be a lot of negative existing vernacular. How do you go about finding then the appropriate precedent to address that place? Because you chose more agricultural sources of inspiration, but what led you to that sort of area to look into, I guess, for the specific Lombard region?
Well, I mean, I'd say in the specific case, it's basically a case of widening the net until I managed to get fish I wanted to catch. Basically, so I looked to rural and agricultural architecture quite a lot because it is still a very identifying element of the place. It's something which the people do identify with. and creates and continues that sense of identity. It does also offer elements that you can use in a new way, perhaps in a more practical way for new housing. So I mean, this is, the challenge that we face really is to try not just copy what happened in the past. You'd have very picturesque, beautiful little towns, but then the developer would say to you, "Oh, where are the balconies? I want some. Where's the garden?" This kind of, unfortunately, perhaps short-sighted kind of criticism is something that we do have to deal with every day. So if we can address that and actually create things which are more interesting for people to live in and give them outside space to have a barbecue in the summer, I mean, really very pragmatically, that is what a lot of agricultural typologies offer or give the potential for offering. So I mean, it's a difficult. There's not. I'm trying to understand how I can make it, how I can transmit this and tell people how to apply it. Maybe this will end up with publication of some sort. It really requires quite a bit of sensitivity to the place, to the people, to make things which still look appropriate and still look like they do belong in a place. I mean, people do this all the time. Modern architects do kind of neo-vernacular farm building houses, the same way that a lot of North American architects do, or builders, let's say, do neoclassical villas. And most of those look pretty terrible, to be honest. So you have to know what is it that makes them work, what doesn't make them work, and how to apply them properly.
I would like to add a comment on this. I totally agree. We always have to think about the way forms develop in a place, and we don't have to forget the fact that, as Professor Weatherill was highlighting, every place has its own materials and the way to use the natural resources and the way they are transferred to architecture. And of course, it's a matter also of needs, of climate, and then many elements. So what we learn from vernacular architecture is the most straightforward way to put together elements which make a sustainable architecture. That is to say, architecture which is matches together the needs of the human beings to have shelter, but at the same time they use in a thoughtful manner the resources. So in this way, when we look at what is around, we find more answers in the architecture of the past than in current architecture.
First of all, I wanted to thank all three of you very much for very, very interesting updates on your work, and interesting to me to know two of the three of you very well and learning that much more about what you do. I had a question specifically to Jonathan, and I was curious about what the use. I see those connectors, the bridges between buildings, but how are they lived? Do they become part of both buildings? Are they connectors or?
Well, I mean, most cases in the architecture I design, they become part of one of the other buildings, and auxiliary space inside a building, generally a bedroom, a living room, a study, something like that. Very simply. I saw Nathan in the back had his hand up earlier.
It's another question for Professor Weatherill. But you had mentioned in your when you were talking to Rob about requiring sensitivity in these sorts of creation of vernacular architecture. And so when you're working on something like this, at what point, if at all, are there opportunities for community feedback? Are you talking to people within the town and saying, okay, what do you identify with? what do you feel like the values of this community are? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are always occasions and needs for things like charrettes, on-site think tanks and sort of brainstorming with architects and the local inhabitants. I mean, in this case, so far, I've been mostly in close contact with the administrators and the planning officials, who have a pretty good idea of what sort of thing the people want. And I have a bit of experience of it myself. But those kind of exchange events are very important to, as you say, understand what people are looking for in the community, in the environment they want to live in. And you can understand a lot more about the local culture and their own society in that, and address it and apply it in your architecture. So it's very important.
Well, while you think of other potential comments and questions, I do have one question. One theme that seems to be common among these papers, and it seems to be problematic at times, and raise several questions, is the theme of identity, of a cultural identity, of a local identity, of a perceived identity by others. So my question is, in this case, for Luca. I was wondering if in your studies you tackle the issue of what's at stake for Petrarch in wanting to be acknowledged as a Roman. You mentioned that he went very seldom to Florence. He spent very little time there. He signed himself as Florentino. But at the same time, he wanted to be acknowledged as Roman citizens. What's at stake in that Roman identity for Petrarch?
First, it came from, he never signed as a Roman. He had the Roman citizenship. He acquired it along with the laurel crown, because in the, what's called, in the Privilegium Laureationis, that is the official document for Petrarch's crowning, coronation, he was also appointed as a Roman citizen. At the same time, he was a courtier of King Robert d'Anjou in Naples, and he had a diploma a few days before as a chaplain of the king. At the same time, he was, after this crowning ceremony, he fled to Parma when he wanted to be a courtesan of Azzo da Correggio, and then he was the administrator of the bishopric of Parma. So, I mean, he had to live, his life was really spread among Europe, among France, Provence, Italy, Northern Italy, mostly Milan, Venice. He was, to recall a title of a book by Chris Celenza, everywhere a wanderer, peregrinus ubique, as I told. But Rome was not only a town to be citizen of, it was a universal idea of power and unity. Also according to Dante, when Dante in the sixth canto, in the Monarchia, of course, but also in the sixth canto of the Paradise, says, exalts the idea of Rome conquering all the known worlds and dominating on the world known since then. It was the 362% of the worlds. But the Roman Empire has as well this idea of being a universal empire, an empire without borders. So being a Roman citizen for Petrarch, it's something like being a citizen of the world. He had no motherland. He signed as a Florentine, when he talked about Dante, I mean, this is a big research that I'm coordinating about the correspondence of Petrarch, about Petrarch's letters. We have divided into 4 units of research into a national and a project endowed by the government, let's say so. And we are trying to collect all the correspondence of Petrarch and to reveal something new and to make appear so that his connections everywhere appear. So he gave birth to a series of relationships in all around Europe. But the ideal center of these relationships as well was the idea of Rome, the idea of Romanity, intended as a universal place without borders, without, I don't want to say without wars and without conflicts, but it was something, a utopia. I mean, a citizenship that was not connected with the, let's say, the struggles of daily politics and struggles for power. Rome was a universal idea of citizenship. And so we have 2 ways, 2 states. The first was to be connected with the antiquity. Petrarch always said some in the letter to the posterity, semper me displicuit, this, I never liked the present times. I'm vetustatis indagator. I want to research the past. I live more safely and more quietly in the past than in the present. So his Rome was the Rome of the past. So first, his Roman citizenship was intended as a connection to the past, but it was also, we can also appreciate it as a, can I say, a way to escape from the political struggles, from the battle for power, from the wars that were very common at that age, and to think about as a unique and universal citizenship, more similar to the city of God than to the earthly towns.
Don't you think that instead of being kind of don't you think that probably instead of escaping from his lifetime, he's modest enough? Of course, there is the pride of belonging to Rome and the grand history of Rome. But on the other hand, I think on those days, these people were wise enough to understand that probably instead of being like today, obsessionate of the future, they were looking for the right path, watching at the back instead of just watching in front of them.
Yes, of course, this is exactly the Renaissance started there. The big book of Francisco Rico, The Dream of Humanism, says exactly the same. I mean, looking backwards, looking to our past, we have to make a rebirth of the past. Not vernacular, but I mean, looking to the past, and this is a very good connection with both of you. The only, I mean, if I don't like my age, I cannot look to the future. I have to restore the past, the glorious past that I had backwards. So exactly, reinventing the future, looking back to the past. The real identity of the Renaissance and the humanism is going back to the past. And if you see what happened in the Florentine courts, let's say in the middle of the 15th century, when they said we act, we perform, we eat as the ancients. They tried to restore the ancient food, the ancient plates, the ancient furniture, the ancient sport, let's say so. The horse in the gym is that we say also at the Olympics now. it's an invention of the Renaissance, because they were, can I say, they thought that in Greece they practiced a sport like that. So the rebirth of the past is total and going around all the aspects of also of the daily life, and it made them feel probably more strong and sure of their, I don't know.
I don't want to take too much time, but we cannot definitely go beyond it. But I just wanted to connect it to that, which is a very interesting discussion. Which was the image of Rome? I mean, in early 14th century, the Rome was the medieval Rome, a Rome that, of course, had remained with these immense ruins, which were expressing a sense of monumentality which no other construction in the city could express. The architecture, the important architecture was the churches that were built, but these churches were based on the principle of the humble Constantine churches, which were simple buildings compared to the massiveness of Roman antiquity. And so, and Rome remained anchored to this kind of simple architectural church layout, while in the rest of Europe was blooming extraordinary architecture. Let's think about the Gothic architecture in France. What he could see in Avignon was incomparably greater than whatever modern building he could see in Rome, or what was in Florence, in Milan, and any other place. So, of course, for Petrarch also, visualizing this immensity of Rome was not possible with the medieval buildings. It had to be Roman. There was no other way.
Of course, the problem is that Dante, if he ever had been in Rome, never talks about the Roman ruins like the Coliseum or the Forum or the columns or so on. He's talking about not really the Castel Sant'Angelo, but the bridge in front of Castel Sant'Angelo for the lines or the pilgrims going back and forth. He's talking about the Lateran in a comparison with the barbarians coming to Rome. And he puts the pine cone of St. Peter in the middle of the hell. But it's not as a symbol. So also the architecture and the buildings of Rome for Dante are symbols, not really objects.
Except the Lateran. The Lateran was the great palace.
Yes, it was a great palace. In fact, in the comparison at the end of the Paradise, he says, I arrived at the Empyrean as the barbarians arriving to the Lateran and being disguised by its immensity and gilded mosaics and so on. Yes, so, and the light of the Lateran.
They wanted to compete with Constantinople. So there was this with the emperor. So this is in the Carolingian period.
But Dante, at least in the Divine Comedy, but also in the Monarchy, never talks about the Roman ruins. Never.
Okay. So there is more to discuss. Thank you. Right. Thank you to all of you.
Any further comments or questions? Okay. I think no, okay. So, okay. If there are several other comments or questions, which kind of was the purpose for this meeting, I will move up here. Okay. I think it's time to wrap up our meeting and thank our three very, very generous presenters today.